Hi guys, my name is Jasmine, and today I'm going to be walking you through my painting process and what I think about when I work on a piece. By no means am I an expert or claim this is the right way to draw because there is no correct way to draw. These are just a few things that I've picked up over my 2 years of doing digital art. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to be using Procreate on the iPad, but any digital drawing program can do everything I'm doing, and for this tutorial, I'm going to be drawing Katarina from League of Legends. Okay, so I first like to start really loosely. Usually I'll have a pose I'm going for in my head, and for this drawing I wanted to do a pose that was just a bit more dynamic than a usual front-facing pose. My tips for drawing poses are that you want to stay away from harsh lines. I find myself always making poses stiff because my lines aren't very natural, so don't be afraid to use more curves and organic shapes when you're sketching, especially when you're drawing people. It's also important to keep track of different angles and perspectives. You want to pay attention to your shapes and understand that everything exists in a 3D space. So if I were instead to draw her from a downward angle, you would see more of the top of her head and less of her body. This is something I still struggle with, but it's something to get better at with practice. And I also often get asked what brush I use, and recently I've been using a round opacity brush for the sketch, and for painting I like to use a soft airbrush. I like the hard edges that the round brush gives me, and the painting process with a soft airbrush helps a lot because when I blend my values together it makes it easier for me. And for this pose specifically, I wanted to go with a very cool and fierce one because this character is an assassin and she's very good at what she does. And I think it's important to think of your drawings as living things. Body language is a form of storytelling and it adds to the believability and realism of your drawing. You can communicate a lot through a character's expression, form, and attitude. You can see her hip is cocked, her expression is relaxed, and you can tell she has a lot of energy. If you didn't know anything about her, you could probably figure out bits of her personality just from her pose. My sketch is also something I like to call a fake grayscale. When people go from grayscale to color, typically they paint with grays and white highlights and they use color filters over that. But strictly I stick to using a black brush with pressure opacity so that when I color, I can color underneath but still have that darker or lighter value from the black being on top of it. I feel like this way works better for me because you don't have to deal with the disconnect of using color filters and you still get the ability to paint and detail with direct colors while still maintaining the values from your sketch. So at this point in the process, my details aren't crazy, but that's because I'm impatient and I like to get to the coloring part of the process as soon as I can. So after I finish my sketch, I go on and I block out the form with some gray so that I don't have any gaps when I lock down the layer to lay down the local colors. And local colors are the colors that the subject is without any light or shadow interfering with your perception of it. For example, the local color of an apple is red, but if you put it under a blue light, the apple that you perceive is now blue. And once I have the colors laid out underneath, I like to lock this sketch layer and throw down some color directly onto the sketch to lighten it up. Areas like the skin I like to color over so that it won't look really dull and gray when I go into rendering. So after that, I go ahead and I combine the two layers. For the majority of the piece, I'm going to be coloring on that one layer with the exception of the hair, which I just put on a layer behind it. And now I'm just rendering and detailing the piece. I like to move things around a lot and make sure that all my values and shadows work to give that character a more 3D look. At this point in my process, it's all about patience. It's very value dependent, especially if you're leaning towards the more realistic painterly style like I am. I like to start off very general at this point, just cleaning up the parts of the sketch that I don't need and then blending out any rough patches, and then I transition into more detailed work. I love starting with the face because I feel like if I'm satisfied with how it looks in the beginning, I'll want to continue the piece, and it's also the most fun for me to paint. I also play around with the colors and adjust them so they're not too dull or they also match more of what I want. And the armor in this piece was something that I really enjoyed working on. The shiny metal is so fun to paint, and one thing I learned when painting armor is that the contrast helps a lot when you're rendering it. A simple harsh light next to a dark value can carry it to that rendered realistic look. And you can see a lot in my process that I tend to hop around from different parts of the drawing because sometimes I get bored of working on one area, so I shift my focus onto another to keep me motivated. So yeah, you can just see from here on out, I am just detailing. When I'm in this part of the process, I like to keep in mind the texture of the different materials on the character. For example, I don't want the skin to have the same texture as the armor. I want the skin to be soft and the armor to be solid. In order to improve your rendering, I would just work on being more observant of the qualities and different materials and textures. You'll notice that armor is very reflective and has harsher contrast than skin, which usually go through more subtle lighting changes. You'll also notice the cloth on her clothing is not as reflective as the armor, but the lighting is more apparent because of the darker material, and you can tell it's cloth because of the texture of the folds and creases. I would say that my personal art style has developed from looking at all the artists I love, taking stylistic choices they use, combining them with each other, and making it my own. I feel like everyone has their own style no matter what. You'll always have those traits of drawings that you find visually appealing, and I think of that as your personal style. If you like manga, for example, that's going to reflect in your style. If you like Renaissance art, that's going to reflect in your style. So even if you're struggling to have a unique art style, it will find you because you have your own interests and what you like to see in art. When I first started digital art, I would always struggle with painting and making sure my drawing didn't look flat. In the earlier stages of my drawings, especially even now, I struggle with finding the correct values. So in order to combat this, I paint in my shadows with a color darker than I would usually anticipate using. Then there's more distinction between the shadows and highlights so they won't get blended together. One thing I love about digital art is the ability to constantly change things and have backups. For example, I can try new things and experiment if I'm not sure about something. I feel like it helps me improve my judgment just because there's no risk of losing my progress and I can see if a change works or not. Oftentimes when I get stuck on a part of the drawing, I'll pull up a reference to help me, especially if I'm working on something I've never drawn before. I think people often underestimate the importance of using references and real-life photos to expand their visual library. For example, for the belts, I was struggling to make them look worn and realistic, so I researched some images online of worn leather, and it helped out a lot. I also get asked about how I paint hair, and honestly, I don't even think I'm that good at it, but what I recommend is thinking about it as something that can frame your character, especially if they have long flowing hair like Katarina. And also think in terms of shapes rather than strands. Going in first and blocking out the hair shape in its entirety will give you a better idea of how to position your hair to make your piece look more visually appealing. For example, you can see in the drawing how Katarina's hair kind of contrasts the way in which her body's moving. The hair is also flowing, which adds more energy and makes the piece more dynamic as a result. So for the rest of this part of the process, I'm just going to repeating my process of rendering and detailing, and I'll meet up with you guys later to give you some tips on lighting. After finishing the tattoo, I move on to the lighting on Katarina. I do this on a separate layer on top with color dodge and an airbrush to get that soft lighting effect. My tips for lighting are to use your local colors and implement ambient occlusion into your lighting. For example, the light will hit Katarina's red hair and that will bounce onto her clothes and armor. You can see I kind of use a purple color on her chest to indicate the bounce of light from her red hair. The reason I use a purple color instead of a direct red color is that you have to remember the colors will fuse together. The color of her brassiere is gray and it will dilute the red. Also, it's far from her hair, so the red color will not be as intense as if it were directly next to her clothes. It also makes the piece more interesting by implementing a variety of colors. It brings the piece to cohesiveness and makes it more believable that they are all connected. You can also see this bounce light affect places like her armor and her daggers. Now I'm moving on to the rim lighting on her hair. I like to use rim lighting because I feel like it makes the piece pop more just by adding a few of those small harsh highlights. It makes the piece feel more 3D and realistic. For the background, I was trying to go for an indoors look, but I figured the lighting scenarios didn't really match up, so I opted for a misty outdoor scene. Typically, you'd want to have an idea of what you want for your background and then plan your lighting accordingly. But at the time, I didn't even think I was going to draw a background because I really don't like drawing them. But in the end, it all worked out. I added more highlights to the background and more color variation of purples and greens to liven up the misty alley that probably many people have died in. But lastly, for the finishing touches, I played around a bit more with the lighting, making sure the background and character were blended in together by adding some green bounce light to her armor, and then I dropped my signature in the corner. So that's it for my drawing process. I hope you all enjoyed and were able to take away something from it. Thank you for watching.